This workshop will explore ways to critique academic texts. Imagine that you have a journal article or an academic book in front of you and you want to critique it. This workshop will show you how. This workshop will give you the full confidence to critique every academic text. This session will cover 5 crucial questions to critique the academic text in front of you. So imagine that you have a text in front of you. It could be a journal article or it could be a textbook, whatever. Here are 5 critical questions to ask. Number 1. Is the text too general? Number 2. Does this text mention its limitations? Number 3. The text states that something has changed, but has anything really changed? Number 4. Is the academic text outdated? Number 5. Does the academic text mention anything about race, gender, or class? We will explore each of these 5 questions in more detail. Question 1. Is the academic text too general? You can critique a text directly because it is too general. If you see a journal article or a book that takes a broad approach, a general approach, you can critique it. We are not attacking the text directly. We are not saying that the article is incorrect or that book is incorrect. We are just saying that it's too generic for us. For example, if your assignment topic is focused on the UK, you can critique a text that looks at the whole of Europe. If your assignment topic is focused on older people, you can critique a topic that looks at the whole population. You can critique a text that looks at the whole population. If your dissertation topic or assignment topic is focused on the 1990s, you can critique a text that looks at the whole 20th century. Broad approaches are not helpful because the focus is too broad. Here we have a blurred picture of this building. This building is blurred because we are using a wide lens. However, when we focus on a specific aspect of the building, it becomes clearer to see. We can better appreciate the challenges and issues of particular industries, particular groups, and so on when we focus on them. Here are some examples of this approach. Smith's study is too generic to contribute to this discussion. His study is too generic, too wide, too extensive, too vast to contribute to our focused investigation. Although there is some value in Smith's study, his coverage is too broad to inform this study. Here we acknowledge that there is some value in Smith's study. There is always something we can take. There is always something we can use. Some small parts may be useful, but as a whole, it is not beneficial to our focused assignment. To be critical is when you are selective. I'll take this, but I'll leave that part. I'll take this, but I'll need to adapt this part. This is being critical. Also, when you critique Smith's study for being too general, you are showing the significance of your own focused assignment. Your assignment rises in value because your assignment is doing what Smith's study is not doing. Your assignment is focused. His study is unfocused. Your assignment is concentrated. His study is generic. I have an activity here. The aim of your paper is to focus on the learning and development of older workers. Which article is too generic for your paper? Article A or Article B? Article B. So just from the title or the abstract, you have found a text to critique. It is not enough to say that the study is too generic. You need to explain why this generic study is problematic to you. So, I want you to give me some of the disadvantages of a study that takes a broad approach. What are the disadvantages of a study that takes a wide, broad, general approach? Number 1 could be there is a failure to appreciate the specific context. Another disadvantage maybe is that the generic study submerges minorities. It submerges women. We do not get to hear their stories. We do not get to hear their narratives. When we mention the disadvantages, we are essentially listing the reasons why the article in front of us is harmful. It is harmful to some industries. It is harmful to minorities. It is harmful to women. It is harmful to some age groups because it neglects their specific concerns. It neglects their specific context. Their uniqueness has been glossed over by this generic study. Here are some examples. Johnson's study fails to appreciate the importance of focusing on a single community. His conflation of industries prevents us from seeing an accurate picture. He has not taken into account recent studies that focus on smaller units. Such a broad sweep has limited usage. Alternatively, you can group general studies together. So in this example, there are several studies that take a very broad international approach. You have identified some general or broad studies and grouped them together into this category. So when you group studies together, it shows ownership and it shows that you are able to have an overview of the literature. Also, show the citations. This is evidence for your grouping studies together. Each study is separated by a semicolon. The market appreciates it when you reference similar studies like this. Here is another example. There are several studies that focus on the entire industry. In contrast, some scholars have taken a different approach by focusing on specific industries. You are showing contrast in this example. You have demarcated two strands of the literature. You identify that one strand has a focus on the entire industry and another strand has a focus on specific industries. You can adopt this technique more broadly. Try to create categories for the literature that you have read. For example, it is possible to divide the literature into three strands: practitioner-focused, client-focused, and industry-centric. These categories were titled by the student. The student realized that some studies mostly focused on a particular aspect, not completely focused, but mostly focused. So the student categorized practitioner-focused studies, they categorized client-focused studies, and they categorized industry-centric studies. Another example, the literature adopts two perspectives: social justice perspective and the business case perspective. So maybe as you read the literature, create a rough table like this in a notepad. One side UK focused studies and another side international focused studies. Just to summarize question 1, you can critique a text because it is too general. We didn't say that the article was wrong or that the book was wrong. We just stated that it was too generic for our study. Generic approaches can be harmful and problematic. Categorize the books and articles that you have read to show that you are well acquainted with the literature. Question 2, are there any limitations? Does the text in front of you state its limitations? Limitations are shortcomings, flaws, problems. Most research-based journal articles state their limitations. When you find these limitations in the article, you can use it against them. You can turn their limitations into your criticisms. By stating their limitations, they have made our job easier. They have given us the critique. They have handed us the keys. This is an example of a limitation mentioned by an author. So we are reading Mark Simons. This is an example of a limitation mentioned by an author. So we are reading Mark Simons' paper and we find this passage. Mark Simons states, "A limitation of my research is that I have not detailed the complex web of relationship." Great. He has given us a critique. We didn't have to invent a critique. We didn't have to find a critique. He just gave it to us. So we turn Simon's confession into our critique. Simon's study fails to detail the complexities of relationships in decision-making contexts. Or Simon offers a simplistic account of the complex web of relationships. These sentences are just examples. You will need to go much more in depth. You can explain why offering a simplistic account is problematic, like we did with the disadvantages. You can explain the importance of detailed explanations. You can undermine Simon with his own admission. Here are some examples. Johnson's methodology reveals the shortcomings of her study. Although Johnson declared that this limitation, it remains problematic because the author himself points to these issues. A question may arise, why do scholars mention the limitation of their studies? There are 3 general reasons. Number 1, it is just part of research culture. You will do the same in your dissertation. Number 2, it allows for us to discern whether this is a good study or a bad study. By giving us the limitations, they have made their study transparent. From this, we can make a judgment on whether this is a good study or a bad study. Number 3, it gives us the opportunity to fill the gap that was left by the author. We have the opportunity to address these limitations in our own study. Where are the limitations found? Towards the end of the journal article, and some journal articles even have a limitation section. I delivered the same session a few years ago, and a student jumped up and said that using limitations of an academic text to refute the text was cheating. This is a fair comment. Have we been unethical? Have we just cheated? Sometimes the limitations are hard to find. We need the authors to come forward and be transparent so that we can critique their admission. It is essentially our judgment versus their judgment. Some authors believe that their limitations do not impact the findings of their study. They believe that their study is still valid. Their study is still relevant. However, we need to judge if this is true. Maybe we can't get past their limitations. Maybe we think that their limitation is not acceptable. Maybe we think that their limitation cannot be swept under the rug. I remember reading a study that had a major limitation. The study looked at the experiences of international students. The limitation was that they were not able to interview the international students directly. The author had to go through the lecturers. It was the lecturers that handpicked the students. So for me, that limitation was unacceptable. It was acceptable to them, but it was not acceptable to me. I can critique the study for that. I would never have known about their recruitment process if they did not declare it in the limitation section. Once they declared it, we can critique it. Number 3, sometimes individuals may state their limitations to preempt any future critique. By coming clean in their study, it could possibly neutralize any possible criticism. Number 3, the text state that something has changed. But has anything really changed? Has there been any real change? When issues are presented as new, you can argue that not much has changed. You will find in the literature that matters may be presented as modern. This is a new threat, a lot of moral panic. There's been a paradigm shift. This is a new model, a new genre, a new perspective, a new epistemology. You will see this constant stream of something being put forward. These are scary new times. This is unprecedented. This is a new trend. This is a new sensation. Essentially, you can critique this by saying, calm down and carry on. Not much has changed. We have seen this before. Matters rarely change overnight. Change is often part of a long process. Or we find that they have reinvented the wheel. Or do we even need this new thing? Don't we have existing approaches to deal with this problem? Calm down and carry on. I'll play this very short clip from Channel 4 with Akala and a now retired Jon Snow. Their discussion epitomizes this critique. Akala is essentially saying, calm down and carry on. We have seen this before.
Yeah, well, so a lot of the research I did, when you look at scholars like Andrew Davies, who writes books about the history of gang crime in Glasgow and Manchester, or Robert McKilwee, who's got volumes of stuff about the history of gang crime in Liverpool, what you see firstly is that this is not a new problem. Every generation pretends gang crime is a new problem. So when you look at the press reports they cite in their scholarship, it's this same sort of sense of moral panic, this unprecedented thing. When actually we've had violent teenage youth gangs for 150, 200 years, maybe even longer. And the social indicators of that violence have remained identical for almost 200 years, as have the sort of facile explanations of
And those social indicators are?
Poverty, domestic abuse, lack of education, so expulsion from school. So for example, almost half the people in prison today in Britain were expelled from school as children, versus just 1% in the population as a whole. Among young people, about half the young people in young offenders institutes were at some point in care growing up, versus about 1% in the population as a whole. So social indicators have remained identical.
Akala's argument was solid, but there were some weaknesses. Whenever you critique or argue, try to use cautious language. This could be due to this. This may be due to this. This may be due to that. Arguably, possibly, feasibly, conceivably. Also, you have to concede on something. You have to show some level of compromise. Something is new about gang violence in 22. It just is. You have to concede that something is new about youth violence. Here are some examples. King's model is not particularly new. He merely adds nuance to Crichton's older model of vocational adjustment. It is not entirely clear why Jones 2006 developed their reflexivity approach. There are several existing approaches that purport to do the same thing. The fourth question, is the text outdated? This one is the most difficult to explain, so bear with me. Always check the publication date of the book or article. If it was published before a major event took place, you can critique it. For example, a journal article on the extension of parental rights was published in 2018. However, a major law was enacted in 2019. This law was impactful. This law changed the landscape. Now we are looking at this 2018 article in 2022. We're looking at this article today. The article is only partially relevant because it was published before the major law came into force. This 2018 journal article does not discuss the impact of the major law that came in 2019 because this article was published before the law was enacted. So we can now critique this outdated 2018 article. Here are some examples. Hodder's analysis of reform in the area of parental rights is limited because it was published before the Parental Rights Act 2018 was enacted. Johnson's study was lightly used because it was published before the recommendation of the Monroe Review was implemented. Johnson's study was lightly used because it was published before the recommendations of the Monroe Review were implemented. There are a number of events that can render an academic study partially relevant. An Act of Parliament, an appointment of a government commission, a new census, COVID-19, and so on. There are two benefits of looking at the date of a publication. Number one, you develop a rationale. You can distinguish your assignment or research project by stating that your work is an update. Several monumental events have occurred since Johnson wrote about intersectionality. Thus, my study represents a much needed update. This gives your work more significance. It's also good to show that you are aware of the context. You haven't just picked the article randomly. You are aware of the context. Johnson's 2018 article was published in a period when you understand what came before the article was written, what was happening during the time the article was written, and what happened after the article was published. In summary, think about the universe around your journal article. Everything is connected. Articles react to other articles react to events, articles build on older theories, articles stand on the shoulders of other articles. Nobody writes in a vacuum. And the last question, does the academic text mention anything about race, gender, or class? If it does not mention anything about race, gender, or class, you can critique it. You can critique a study if it neglects or only barely mentions race, gender, or class. There are seldom issues in which race, gender, and class is not a significant factor. You can also add to the list age, disability, neurodiversity. Jones fails to acknowledge the significance of gender in this issue. The author overlooks the fact that race contributes to the highest rate of. Another weakness is that we are given no explanation of how social deprivation impacts. The research does not take into account pre-existing tensions of gender and